tell you something that runs contrary to the mainstream of paleontological thought. If you pick up a textbook nowadays on paleontology, if you pick up a lot of technical articles, most of my colleagues will tell you there were 5 great mass extinctions in the history of life. I'm going to tell you that's nonsense, that's hyperbole at best. There were only 2 great extinctions in the history of life, and whether we're living another one of them, that's a whole other issue. So I'm going to present something, there was an article recently published in New Scientist where I was interviewed where we talked about extinctions, and one of my British colleagues, who I like to refer to as one of Britain's great science fiction writers, he actually said, Lucas is outside of the mainstream. And in science, if the mainstream's wrong, the only person who's going to see that is a person outside of the mainstream. So I'm going to show you something radical. If there were, I'm looking around the room to see if there are any of my professional enemies here. You know, if there are other paleontologists who work on extinctions who would tell you they wouldn't even be nice enough to say I was outside of the mainstream. They would say something a little stronger about my ideas. But that aside, let me present you with something that I think is very interesting that I've been working on for, well, actually almost 40 years. So when I was in diapers, I began studying mass extinctions, and let's go from there. Okay, these are the conclusions of my talk. I'm going to show them to you again a couple of times. You know, it's always good when you give a talk, tell the audience your conclusions, then tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them the conclusions again. So, like I said, a lot of hyperbole here. There were really only 2 big extinctions in my analysis. If you wanted to know what causes mass extinctions, this is not controversial. Most paleontologists would say it's probably big volcanic events. I agree with that. And I would tell you, you know, we sit around, we write grants, we want to study extinction, and one of the games we play, we being paleontologists, say, oh, well, maybe if we understood dinosaur extinction, it would help us understand our own extinction or how to avoid extinction. I'm not as generous as that. I don't think we're smart enough to figure out how to not go extinct. And I certainly don't think these extinctions have much to teach us about ongoing extinctions or future extinctions. I'll explain that to you in greater detail. Okay. Everybody here knows what extinction means, right? You just hear gone, boom, extinct, out, the lights are out, everyone's gone. Extinction is typically, it has a connotation of failure. If you went extinct, somehow you blew it, somehow you didn't adapt or whatever. So there is that aspect to it. Big extinctions have dramatic or big causes. So they're exciting subjects. Oh, an asteroid hit the Earth and it wiped out all the dinosaurs. That's a movie. You know, what could be more exciting than that? And like I said, there's this idea of, well, you know, we need to understand extinction so we can prevent our own extinction. I've already told you what I think of that. But it's exciting stuff. It's easily sensationalized. Here's a book by Mike Benton, who's another one of my favorite British science fiction writers, a colleague of mine. It's got a wonderful title, When Life Nearly Died. God, I hope that sold books, because life never nearly died. Hasn't even gotten close. The biggest extinctions never got life anywhere near dying out. But Professor Benton came up with a clever title, and like I said, it sold books. There are different kinds of extinctions. When you study extinction, there are different kinds. The first one, I'm going to differentiate 3 things here. The first one is what's called background extinction. Okay, at any moment in time in the history of life, right now, things are going extinct for diverse reasons. And in fact, the vast majority, 99% perhaps, of all the species that have ever lived on this planet are extinct. Okay, so we recognize it, as paleontologists, as students of the evolutionary process, that extinction is ongoing. And it's referred to as background extinction. What you're seeing here, the diagram, is a pretty typical diagram. You see it in a lot of paleontological publications. The vertical axis here is time, and it's shown to you as a rock column. And then what you're seeing, you have to read this, you're seeing the ranges in time, or the ranges in the rocks, of these are microorganisms, they're protozoans, foraminifers. And what you see is a very typical pattern. When you plot up almost any group of fossils, you're seeing a lot of background extinction. This thing disappeared, that one, you know, they're disappearing at different times, and this is ongoing. And I don't want to talk about it. It's a really interesting subject because you have to ask yourself, why would anything go extinct anyway? Why would the evolutionary process create a world, a planet, on which organisms were always going extinct? Why not create organisms that were immortal, that stuck around forever, right? But that's not my subject, okay? But it is important to remember that this background extinction is always going on. So then the question becomes, what is a mass extinction? Okay, a mass extinction is a big extinction, right? It's an extinction of a whole lot of organisms in a very short period of time. And, you know, there are different ways to define it, but these are what I think are the critical aspects of what I would call a mass extinction. And I'm being generous here. When I say you've got to have 50% or more of the species go away, that, I would tell you, that number, 50% or 60%, those are very soft numbers. They're usually based on what can only be called back of the envelope type calculations. So I don't trust those numbers. If I trusted them more, I'd probably be a little more hard-nosed and say, oh, I think it should be 70% when extinct. But I'm not sure I can tell whether 70% or 50% went extinct at most times in the past. The biggest thing, more important, is we've got to lose major groups of organisms, what are called clades, branches. We've got to lose a whole big group of organisms, like say the dinosaurs. Boom, they're gone, okay? And that's an important aspect of a mass extinction. And then this is really important. This was pointed out by a paleontologist named George McGee a number of years ago. We've got to see some remodeling or restructuring of the ecosystem. It's not that you just knock things off. If you knock things off, who does the day-to-day work that those organisms were doing? If I've got a seafloor, and I've got a bunch of organisms that live on that seafloor, and then they go extinct, who's going to live on that seafloor next? And how are they going to live? And typically in mass extinctions, we see restructuring of the ecosystem. We see new players who come in, and we see new ways of exploiting resources. So that's a critical characteristic, and then it's got to be fast. And again, here I'm hedging my bets when I say less than 1 million. Put a gun to my head, I'd say probably 100,000 years. These things are very quick events in geologic time. The problem is, the farther back we go in time, our ability to discriminate small time intervals diminishes. So by the time we get to 300 million years, we're lucky if we can discriminate an event that took place in 1 million. It's harder, almost impossible in those older rocks to pick out events that only took 10,000 years. And you know, when you talk about the asteroid impact that supposedly wiped out the dinosaurs, you have people in the technical literature talking about events that took 10 years or 100 years, which we really cannot discriminate, but hypothetically there must be such very quick events. So these are the key features of mass extinctions, and it's critical, this definitional thing is very critical because these are the criteria by which I'm going to judge the so-called Big Five. And you're going to see, by my analysis, 3 of them don't meet most of these criteria. They're not mass extinctions. Then there's something in the middle, which we don't really call an extinction. We call it a diversity crisis. And what a diversity crisis is just simply a diversity crash. You lose a certain number of species or whatever taxa you're looking at, but you don't see big groups go away. And you don't have big enough numbers. You don't lose 50 or 60 or 70% of the diversity. But you do have these diversity crashes that are well documented. And so it's interesting, this whole idea of 5 big extinctions was essentially cooked up at the University of Chicago in the early 1980s by a couple of paleontologists, David Raup and Jack Sepkoski. And Sepkoski published this chart, this diagram in '82, and here's the time scale. And then you can just see from the arrows, the 5 biggest arrows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the big 5. Well, what are these? I call them the little 17, or whatever. They are the diversity crashes. And one of the good examples that you may know about is just the extinction of the megafauna at the end of the last ice age. So we know in Western North America, end of the last ice age, say 10 to 12,000 years ago, a lot of the big animals went extinct. The ground sloths, the mammoths, the camels, the horses, they all went extinct. That turns out not to be a mass extinction by my criteria. Nobody actually believes it's a mass extinction.
it's a diversity crisis. It's an important extinction, it's an important set of events, because as you can imagine, before the extinction, you had things like mammoths wandering the prairies of North America. The big animals, ecologically an important animal, but it's gone. Okay, but it's still not, this does not rise to the level of a mass extinction. So I'm not trying to be semantic really, I'm just trying to define three different things. Background extinction, mass extinction, diversity crisis. Those are the three things. And I'm going to tell you that I only see two big mass extinctions in the history of life. There's lots of diversity crisis, and it's background extinction all the time. It's going on. And that's true today as well. Well, we've known, when I say we, I just mean paleontologists. It's not the royal we, it's just we, paleontologists. We've known about big extinctions since the 1800s. This is an amazing diagram that a British paleontologist named John Phillips published in 1860. Okay? And this is a real back-of-the-envelope type analysis. The time scale is here. And what Phillips did is he said, look, I have, and this is diversity. You see there's no numbers. It's just kind of a crude estimate of overall diversity. So here I have kind of low diversity, and then I have a crash. Then diversity climbs, then I have a crash. Then diversity climbs, and here I am in the present. And Phillips did that because he wanted to distinguish the three big blocks of time that we use in the geologic time scale: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. Paleozoic meaning ancient life, Mesozoic or Mesozoic meaning intermediate life, and Cainozoic or Cenozoic. Kainos means recent in Greek, so this is the recent life. But what really is amazing to me is that Phillips in 1860 already knew there were two big extinctions. And I'm going to tell you, that's all we know now. Those are the two big extinctions. And I'll talk about, it's funny, I made this talk a little over a year ago. And I actually gave it at C&M in Albuquerque then. And I've reworked it a little, updated it. I've made it more Los Alamos friendly, whatever that means. But it occurred to me, how did Phillips do this? So I actually looked into it, and I got it. You can go on Google Books and get the book he wrote that this was in. And what he did was he primarily relied on one of his British colleagues who had simply sat down and written a monograph and said, here's all the species of British fossils in these rocks, here's all the species in those rocks and that. So by 1860, this guy had tallied up enough diversity that Phillips was able to extract two major drops in diversity, two big extinctions. And that is really amazing when you consider that paleontology as we know it really didn't begin until around 1800. Nobody was studying fossils, and this was in Western Europe, primarily France, Britain, Germany, the way nobody was doing that before about 1800. So there's half a century of research. Phillips has got it right. What are we doing wrong a couple of hundred years later? But anyway, I'll talk about that more. And then causes, are a big thing. We want to know what caused the extinction. I'll talk about that too. That's not so easy. Okay, what does cause mass extinctions? Well, if you look in the literature, they'll tell you it's either big volcanic events, impact events, and then I'm going to tell you, though, the main cause of mass extinctions is library research. And the reason I say that is these Chicago paleontologists went to the library, and they went through the technical literature of paleontology, and we have monographs and compendia where people say, this species A lived in this time interval, B lived in this time interval. And what they simply did is they went through and toted up all of the taxa. They didn't even do species, because you can't find a comprehensive literature that tells you when all the species lived. They didn't even do genera, which are groups of species, because again, you don't have that. They did families. Families are groups of genera. But that said, what they did is they toted up diversity through time in the library, and that created a curve, I'll show you in a minute, that identified 5 big drops in diversity, and those became the so-called Big 5 extinctions. And, the literature of any science, if you've done science, doesn't matter what, is problematic in many ways. It's incomplete, there are errors, there are a lot of problems. One of the problems that Sepkoski and Raup, the guys who compiled it, is they couldn't read Russian or Chinese. So they didn't compile any of the Russian or the Chinese literature. And I can tell you, I worked in the former Soviet Union. The Soviets had tons of great paleontologists. Soviet paleontology literature would fill this room 10 times over. And it's not in their analysis. It's all Western languages, you know, primarily English, of course, French, German, Spanish. That's what they compiled. And the Chinese literature, too, was not compiled. So right off the bat, these guys were working with an incomplete set of data. But I would tell you that's what really created these extinctions, is their efforts in the library. Okay, so here's the curve Septossi published. Okay, the time scale here is horizontal. This is number of families. You have to read it. But these numbers, these are the big five. Okay, so what happens, and this is a really fascinating subject that I don't want to get into either, the history of diversity. There are different ideas about diversity. We believe that we start somewhere with 0 species. At some point on Earth, we have fossils now almost as old as the crustal rocks on Earth. So we don't know how far back life went, but when we look at the oldest rocks, there are very few species. So the thinking is diversity starts at 0, it takes off like a rocket, it gets to a point where it kind of bounces around a plateau, then there's this huge drop, this big extinction, then it just keeps climbing afterwards. And I will tell you that if you believe that curve, I've got a bridge to sell you, okay? Because there are a lot of problems with what I just told you. And one of the biggest problems is if we look at rock volume, how much rock do we have? The amount of rock we have increases just like this curve. So it could be that the diversity is just telling us how much rock is out there to preserve fossils in. But that aside, this is the big five. And they are attributed to different causes. One of the things that really got me interested in this subject about 20 years ago was I kind of did a thought experiment, because I mostly work on non-marine fossils of animals that lived on land. And it occurred to me, I thought, okay, what was the first big extinction where we know there was an extinction in the sea or in the oceans, and there was a coeval extinction on land? That's an important question, because if you have an extinction on land and sea, that could have must have, I would say, a very different cause than just an extinction in the sea or just an extinction on land. At the time, I thought it had to be the end Permian extinction, the big one, but I've since rethought that. So I published an article a few years ago about non-marine extinctions. I'll talk about that more later. So here are my conclusions again. Just to drill them home, I'll show them to you one more time at the end. So here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go through the so-called Big Five, okay, in time, and talk about the structure and what we know about it. So the first extinction is this late Ordovician. It's a time period about 450 billion. And this is the planet. This is where we think the continents were at the time. The southern continents formed together rather early into what we call Gondwana, which is the union of South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and believe it or not, the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent was part of Gondwana. It wasn't part of Asia. It's a long time later. And then North America, as we know, was here. And North America was part of an ancient continent we call Laurentia. And Laurentia consisted of North America, Scotland, and get this, Greenland. They were all one continent at one time, so it makes you think, doesn't it? Anyway, why not? Why not reunite Laurentia? You know, I used to have a bumper sticker that said, no, I had a bumper sticker years ago that said, reunite Gondwana Land. You know, you could buy it at geology. And I remember I had a guy come over to the house, this is like 30 years ago, to fix the washing machine. And he commented on it because he had, like many geologists, gotten a geology degree but found useful employment elsewhere. So he was fixing washing machines even though he had a degree in geology. But anyway, this is what the world looked like. And the reason I show this is the critical element in paleontological thinking is what happens to Gondwana as we go through the Ordovician. And what happens to Gondwana, and we know this, is Gondwana will drift southward so that it essentially goes over the South Pole like Antarctica today. And when that happens, there's a huge ice age in Gondwana. And that huge ice age presumably affects global sea level temperatures. And that's what people think is the cause of whatever extinctions are occurring at this time. What do we know about life at the time? Well, by Ordovician time, the oceans are very diverse. Lots of animals, trilobites, these are graptolites, strange group of extinct animals, all sorts of critters in the ocean. There's very little living on land though. Land life, there are no vascular plants, there are some bryophytes, but there are no plants, you know, with plumbing, which is what vascular plants are. And as far as we know, there are no animals living on land. There's debate about that now, and the debate is not based on the fossils of animals, it's based on what we call their trace fossils. There are trackways that are in Ordovician rocks that we think were made by animals like millipedes or scorpions, and there's been big debate about were these really living on land? Were they marine animals that just came out on land periodically? That debate's not resolved. But the fact is, there is so little living on land that we see no evidence of a terrestrial extinction. Okay? Whatever happened in the late Ordovician happened in the seas. Okay, I'm going to show you some charts like this. These are from a book that a couple of British paleontologists wrote some years ago. And the time scale is horizontal here. And what these polygons are trying to show you is diversity. So whenever the polygon is big and fat like this, diversity is high, and then you see how diversity drops, then it re-expands. Well, what's supposed to happen at the end of the Ordovician, that for reasons that really elude me, some of my colleagues call a mass extinction, is there actually were two diversity crises. And I'm not making this up. They write papers and they talk about these, and then they say, oh, there was a mass extinction. I'm like, well, what are you talking about, man? Not only are there just two diversity crises, but they're at least 2 million years apart. So this is not a mass extinction. Neither one on its own is a mass extinction. So you can wipe the Ordovician off the plate. It's just not a mass extinction. You can see there are drops in diversity. None of the big groups go away. Everybody comes back. There are no major clade extinctions. There is no restructuring of communities or ecosystems as far as we can tell. So these are two diversity crises separated in time by a couple of million years, not a mass extinction. This illustrates, this is kind of artwork, there's that big ice age in Gondwana. Here's Gondwana, very late in the Ordovician. It's sitting right on the South Pole. We know there were big ice sheets there, and there were substantial extinctions, diversity drops in the marine realm with the beginning of the ice age and the end of the ice age. So what the paleontologists who study this say is, oh, here's what happened. At the beginning of the ice age, water got colder. So the animals that couldn't adapt to cold water went extinct. Then at the end of the ice age, water got warmer, and the animals who couldn't deal with the warmer water went extinct. Now, you got to tell me, how can you tell whether a 350 million year old brachiopod preferred warm or cold water? This is not high science. So this one goes away. This one dies easy as far as mass extinctions. So here's what I would say to you. Again, two diversity crises, 2 million year separation, no big anything in my criteria. So this is not a mass extinction. So we're down to 4 now. That's the first one of the big 5 to hit the bricks. Let's talk about the next one, the late Devonian. Okay, this is the Devonian world again, and you'll recognize it. Okay, here North America's more now. We've got more of Europe. We're not just Greenland and us. We've got more, and Gondwana has moved around, etc. But what's interesting, this is probably the least well understood of the so-called Big 5. And the reason I say that is there's no agreement on causation. The Ordovician stuff, yeah, I saw an article just came out saying, well, maybe there was some big Ordovician volcanism that mattered, but that's pretty new science. I'm not sure how that'll stand up to examination. Here, one of the arguments again is, well, Gondwana's far enough south that there was a big ice age. And we actually know that now. When I got into the field some years ago, nobody thought there were any late Devonian ice ages. Now it's well agreed on. So an ice age is a possible cause. But I'm going to tell you that this is not that different from the later Ordovician. What we see here, again, are two diversity crises. The difference is they're separated by 13 million years instead of 2. So why people call that a mass extinction also is beyond me. If we ask what was living, the most amazing thing about the Devonian is it's when forests appear. It's when we get the first trees. So now we really do have vascular plants. We have forests. We have, people call it the age of fishes. We've got very diverse, nasty, unattractive fishes, swimming in the world's oceans, etc. This is an important event to create forest Because when you create extensive vegetation on land, you then get the weathering of rock that forms soils. And when you form soils, you change the chemistry of river waters, of lake waters. It changes a lot. And a lot of people think that what happened late in the Devonian maybe had a lot to do with that. But the fact is, it's a very different world than the Ordovician. Here's that similar kind of diagram. Okay, so here are the two so-called extinctions. Well, here's the earlier one, and they're separated. There's 13 million years between these two red lines. Okay, so there's no way you're going to roll this into one extinction. Now, one of the things that has happened, just to be fair to what's going on, is there are paleontologists now who are arguing that this, only the second red line, was really a big mass extinction. But that's a discussion that's ongoing. The fact is, again, look at this. There aren't, most of the clades, they drop diversity, they come back. It's only here that you start to see some of the groups disappear and not come back. But I would say this definitely, this earlier extinction, the diversity crisis, does not rise to the level of a mass extinction. This might rise to the level of mass extinction, but the jury's out. It's being actively researched, and I don't know when we'll get enough data and agreement to really say something beyond what we know now. Okay, so what happened? I just told you there was, there were a lot of weird fishes that lived in the Devonian, particularly jawless fishes. We only have a few fish today, hagfish, lampreys, that don't have jaws. They all pretty much went extinct. So really, if you look at this extinction, it's mostly an extinction of fishes. There's not a lot else that goes extinct. So what's the cause? And like I said, it's not agreed on. Okay, we have an ice age. Here's a nice ice age in the southern hemisphere again. Maybe volcanism has been invoked. This is a really interesting idea that nobody believes anymore. And it's the idea that when the forests appeared, like I was saying, when land plants really took over, they changed the nature of water chemistry in the rivers that flowed into the sea. And that chemistry change had caused the extinctions, which is an interesting idea, but nobody buys it. Probably not a big enough cause. So, here we go. Two diversity crises separated by 13 million years. Yeah, there were some clade extinctions. There was no reconstructing of the ecosystem in the marine realm. There's zero evidence of terrestrial extinctions. And onward we go. Now, I'm going to throw this in. This is a ringer. There might have been a sixth extinction. You know, you think Big Five. Well, this could have been the Big Six. This was a Middle Permian extinction that took place, and it took place mostly among certain groups of reptiles on land. It's really unclear whether there were plant extinctions to go along with them. The marine extinctions that may have occurred are not agreed on, but this is a very interesting, this is the Middle Permian extinction that really never made it to the level of the Big Five, and some paleontologists think it should be there. It was long combined with the end Permian extinction. It occurred a few million years before the end of the Permian, but when you have poor time resolution, when you can't pull apart the little time intervals, you can mix things together and you can conflate the extinctions to make them look bigger, and that's what happened. This is something that really needs more work. I did some work on this. I wrote a paper in 2009 about the reptile extinction, but it's still a lot of uncertainty here. All right. This is the first big mass extinction. This is the biggest mass extinction of all time. This is not debatable. This is really quite clear, well, at least in the sea. This is the end Permian extinction that occurred 250 million or so years ago. You can see at the time, the continents have come together to form one supercontinent. And you know, when I was young, in college, 5 years ago, whatever, no, a long time ago, we were taught to call, well, here we have Gondwana, you see South America, Africa, blah, blah, blah. And we were told to call this continent Laurasia. Does anybody remember that term, Laurasia? It shouldn't be called Laurasia because most of Asia, North China, South China, Indochina, was not even part of the supercontinent. The only things that were Asian that were part of the supercontinent were Siberia, and this is called Kazakhstania, or the Turin Plate in Central Asia. And so what we call this supercontinent now is we either call it Laurussia, or probably better, Euro-America, Europe plus America. That's the northern continent. So these continents have come together. The world's quite different. And there still is ice in Gondwana, but nobody thinks this extinction was driven by ice. We know a lot about what lived late in the Permian. The oceans were full of all sorts of sharks and cephalopods. On land, there were all sorts of attractive, interesting reptiles and stuff running around. We have quite a good fossil record here. We have amphibians, reptiles, etc. So what happened? Well, here's that same kind of diagram. The time scale's horizontal. Look at this. This is the extinction. You see a lot of clades are either going away, maybe coming back. This is a big thing. Hard-hit groups, a lot of marine groups, and one of the biggest groups to go away are the ammonites or the ammonoids, almost totally extinct at the end of the Permian. Brachiopods are kind of clam-like animals. They're still around, but their diversity is decimated at this time. Studies in southern China suggest that this extinction took less than 200,000 years, which if you think, if you can discriminate that short of a time interval, 250 or so million years ago, that's pretty amazing. So I think this is really quite impressive. There was no terrestrial mass extinction. I told you when I first thought about this problem, I thought it might be this, but when I actually studied the extinctions of reptiles and amphibians at the end of the Permian, there was no big extinction. And one of the things you still find in the literature is people saying, oh, well, all these funky, weird, old reptiles went extinct and the dinosaurs took over. And that's not true at all. The dinosaurs don't take over till tens of millions of years after this extinction. But you'll still, it's amazing, I still see this stuff in the technical literature. This is something I published in 2017. If you look at the best terrestrial record, the best on-land record of the end Permian extinction, at least for reptiles, and tetrapod means here reptiles plus amphibians. They're tetrapods. This is the record from the Karoo Basin in South Africa. Time is horizontal, and here you're seeing the ranges of all these genera, really, and here's the end of the Permian. And so what you see is what goes extinct, almost all goes extinct before the end of the Permian. It doesn't go extinct at the same time as the marine extinction, and the number of genera that disappear is really rather small. And in this article, which I published in 2017, I looked at, we call this turnover, when they go extinct, turnover rates. And I looked at turnover rates throughout the Permian. And it turns out, throughout the Permian, that is the average turnover rate. It's somewhere between 5 and 10 genera that disappear across time boundaries. So why is this a mass extinction? It's no different than all the other turnover events in the Permian that no one calls a mass extinction. It's a problem. Everyone agrees on this. Volcanism caused the extinction. The biggest volcanic field of the last 600 million years it's called the Siberian Traps. It's a huge volcanic field in what's now western Siberia. But you have to really be careful here. You can say volcanism caused the extinction. Well, then you say, well, how did it do that? And the answer is we don't really know. And so the way to think of it is the volcanism was the trigger. But the bullet that actually caused the extinction, we don't fully understand. We're pretty sure it's what came out of the volcano, but not the lava. When the lava flows out of the volcano and you're stupid enough to stand in its way, you go extinct, right? But you can't get a global extinction from any volcanic eruption, even a field like this, unless you talk about the volatiles, the gases that come out of the volcanoes. And the problem is it's almost impossible to know what gases came out of an ancient volcano. Today we can watch a volcano erupt, and we know that volcanoes put out water vapor, they put out sulfur dioxide, they put out a lot of so-called greenhouse gases like methane, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. But to look at an extinct volcano and know what the volatiles were, we can't do that. So what you'll see if you look at the technical literature on this is you'll see people modeling different possibilities. I wrote an article several years ago with a colleague of mine I'm not a volcanologist, but he is more of one. And we basically said, okay, all these volcanoes erupted. What if sulfur dioxide was one of the primary products? Well, that creates acid rain right off the bat. You put that up in the air, you mix it in water, you get sulfuric acid, boom, terrible. What if it was carbon based stuff like methane, CO2, whatever, then you get a greenhouse. Greenhouse could cause extinctions. You know, what if it was mostly particulates, dust, debris, then that could cool the planet. See, there's no way to really know. So where we're at with this is, I think everyone agrees that the volcanism was pretty surely the trigger. And somebody's going to figure out, some genius will figure out how to look at a piece of lava and say, oh yeah, that volcano was putting out CO2 or whatever. But we can't do that now, and I'm not sure we'll ever be able to do that. So, this is important. Permian seafloors were fundamentally different from Triassic seafloors after the extinction. Permian seafloors were occupied by what we would call, or I would call, the typical shelly benthos. Benthos is the animals that live on the sea bottom. Typical shelly benthos at the end of the Permian, the Paleozoic, are bryozoans, sea fans, brachiopods, which kind of look like clams, crinoids, you guys know crinoids, little disc-shaped pieces of shell. They're almost totally wiped out with this extinction, and they're replaced by what you can essentially call modern seafloors. What is the shelly benthos on any seafloor since the end of the Permian? It's dominantly mollusks, clams and snails dominate, and that's true today, just like it was back after this extinction. So to me, that restructuring of the ecosystem is a huge event, and that to me bespeaks a really substantial mass extinction. Let's move on. End Triassic. This is actually my favorite because I've probably done the most original work on this. This is about 200 million. Here, we're starting to see Pangea breaking up. We're beginning to see the opening of the Gulf of Mexico, separation of Europe and North America, which will go on for some time. Gondwana's still hanging in there, etc. Late Triassic biota, we know a lot. Big marine reptiles, all sorts of creatures in the seas, and of course, we have the first dinosaurs. And we really, on land, we go from a tetrapod, a reptile biota that's dominated by what used to be called mammal-like reptiles or synapsids, reptiles that are more related to mammals than they are to living crocodiles, things like that. And we turn it over into a dinosaur, an archosaur is the word we use, dominated set of terrestrial predators and the like. But that happens over millions of years, and it certainly doesn't happen at the end of the Triassic with a supposed extinction. So what happened? Well, these are radiolarians. They're microscopic protozoans, and they still live today. They secrete a silica shell. Okay? So you know what they are? They're tiny little pieces of glass. Nobody eats these things. They are the dominant plankton at this time. They suffer a big extinction. They don't totally go away, but there's a big extinction. And one of my colleagues wrote an article some years ago saying, oh, it was a big plankton extinction, it's a big deal. This is not a big deal. I remember asking, I thought, oh, what in the world, who would eat this stuff? So I knew a couple of radiolarian experts. I emailed them, I said, hey, who eats radiolarians today? Answer, well, some fish who don't look at what they're eating, swallow them occasionally. Nobody's eating this stuff, it's glass, right? So their extinction is not ecologically that big of a deal. There is a collapse of reefs, but that doesn't occur globally. There are extinctions of amphibians and reptiles, but what we were able to show, me and my collaborators over the last 20 years, is these extinctions are spread out over millions of years. They are not a single extinction. The idea of a single extinction at the end of the Triassic was largely an artifact of poor time resolution, of people putting together stuff that took place over millions of years into one event. So this is something we published some years ago. Timescale here is vertical. You have to really read it. The end of the Triassic is here. And these are all the big extinction events and things that go on. You see how they're spread out over millions of years? This is not a single mass extinction, not by a long shot. Both in the sea and on land. There is neither a mass extinction in the sea or on land at the end of the Triassic. What there are is a series of extinctions that were conflated, were crammed together by poor timescale resolution. Once you tease out the time, you can see that this was a period. Of course, there's a big question here, why so many extinctions over many millions of years, but I won't answer that right now. Okay, finally we get to the end Cretaceous. This is the last of the big five, okay? And I would say this is the other big extinction. So the end Permian is the first one. The end Cretaceous is the second one. This, of course, is the time of dinosaur extinction. But I'm going to tell you that I don't think dinosaur extinction was part of a mass extinction on land. Oh man, is that heresy. When I got up at a meeting, big geology meeting in, what was it, in Seattle some years ago, and I said, oh my God, you know, I almost got egged. You know, people almost wanted to kill me for saying that. Because I actually had a reasoned argument. I'll show you. Okay, so here we are at the end of the Cretaceous. The world is starting to look modern now, right? We can see the continents separating out. We've got discrete, you know, Gondwana's busted up. Here's India. India's going to float northward. It's going to drift northward and collide with Asia, with southern Asia, at about 50 million. And then it'll become the subcontinent, Indo-Pakistan, becomes part of Asia at 50. It was originally part of Gondwana. The Antarctic, Australia, southern Gondwana is still united. North America is pretty much coming to its own. Greenland is separate. Europe, there's a seaway that's kind of cutting, you know, sort of eastern Siberia off from Western Europe. But everything's starting to look a lot more modern. And, you know, dinosaur extinction, I mean, what more exciting extinction is there? Right? Thank God they went extinct. They didn't go extinct, really, did they? The birds are their descendants. Right? We have, in Albuquerque, roadrunners are like controlling our lives now. You know that? No, it's serious. We have a roadrunner that comes to the house, and that bird walks the back wall, like every day, looking for whatever, you know? And it's amazing. And my wife was commenting, you know, you look at that roadrunner, and it's just like a little meat-eating dinosaur. It's incredible. But that's not my point anyway. I'm not going to diminish dinosaur extinction. Some paleontologists do. They'll say to you, dinosaur extinction wasn't important because they didn't really go extinct. The birds survived. I would say to you, hey, I know a dinosaur when I see a dinosaur, and I know a bird when I see a bird. You know, and they may be closely related, but the fact that birds survive doesn't diminish the significance of dinosaur extinction. Because when you knock off the dinosaurs, it's like the megafaunal extinction at the end of the Ice Age. You're killing all the big animals on land, and that's ecologically significant. That matters. But I don't think it rises to a mass extinction, as I'll tell you. The other thing about it that's interesting is this is the only one of the big 5 extinctions that's been shown to coincide with an asteroid or whatever, a bolide impact. Okay? Back in the early 80s, when Luis Alvarez, who was once in this room, right? Right. Luis Alvarez's son, Walter, is a geologist. They were in Italy, and they were looking at the chemistry of rocks across the end of the Cretaceous. And they found this layer that was very rich in iridium. And they didn't know what to make of it, because iridium is normally quite rare on the Earth's surface. But Louis, smart guy that he was, realized, hey, this probably came from some extraterrestrial body. So he pitched the idea of an impact coming down and occurring, and now that's well accepted. There's no question there was an impact. However, what it did is still up for grabs. Did it really wipe out the dinosaurs? What do we know about the Cretaceous biota? Loads of stuff. Lots of things living in the sea. We still had ammonites, dinosaurs on land, flowering plants, yada, yada, yada. You know, all sorts of modern groups had already appeared. Mammals, turtles, you know, crocodiles, all these things were running around. It's an alien world at one level, and it's a very familiar world at another. There were extensive marine extinctions at the end of the Cretaceous. And here's what's interesting. The remodeling, the ecosystem restructuring was not of the seafloor community. It was of the nekton, the in-the-water community, the swimming community. So you lost all the big marine reptiles, you know, the Loch Ness monsters and things like that. Well, Loch Ness monster's still with us. In fact, that's Los Alamos' next big project, to find it, right? But no, we lost all these big marine predators, and importantly, we lost the ammonites. And the ammonites were this vast group of predatory cephalopods who were, you know, an important part of the nectonic means swimming community. The planktonic community was also hit. The forams, the nanoplankton, there were big extinctions. So again, in the marine world, I would say, yeah, there's a major ecosystem restructuring, not of the sea bottom, but of what's swimming in the water above it. There was loss of major clades, things like the different groups of marine reptiles, the ammonites in particular. This looks like a mass extinction to be in the oceans. But on land, This is a diagram I published with a former student of mine some years ago. The time scale is vertical. This is turtles. And here's the end of the Cretaceous. That's the extinction point. These are the stratigraphic or time ranges of all the big turtle groups. Do you see a big extinction of turtles? I don't. There was no big extinction. This is not controversial. There was no mass extinction of turtles. There was no mass extinction of crocodiles. There was no mass extinction of birds. Well, let's talk turtles and the crocodile. Some of them, there were 40-foot long crocodiles at the end of the Cretaceous. They were every bit as big dinosaurs. There were dinosaurs the size of chickens, little animals, and they went extinct. So size obviously was not selecting. But one of the problems with this extinction, particularly on land, is its selectivity. Okay? It's easy if everyone goes extinct. Oh wow, sky fell. We're all gone. But well, how do you deal with the selectivity? How do you explain the fact that I've got all these dinosaurs going extinct, and at the same time I've got turtles, not all of whom were aquatic. It's not that they lived in water. That's not the explanation. Maybe it is for some of them. But the fact is I've got turtles and crocodiles whose size overlap the dinosaurs. The crocodiles, many were predators. They didn't live that different of a life in some ways than big predatory dinosaurs. Why don't they go extinct? So that selectivity is a real interesting problem. It's never really been fully understood. Let's look at dinosaur extinction. This is the record from Montana, where you have the best record of dinosaur extinction. On this diagram, the vertical axis is time. These are the species. I put a red rectangle around the dinosaurs. When you look at this, it doesn't look that different from the background extinction diagram I showed at the beginning of the talk. So what ends up happening? Well, maybe 50 tetrapod genera, if you count them all up, and you see they're going extinct or disappearing at different times, go away, and only about 10 of them are dinosaurs. This is an interesting diagram. The time scale here is horizontal. This was published by a very famous paleontologist, Edwin Colbert, who was a big dinosaur expert, in '65. In a little book called The Age of Reptiles. If you ever see The Age of Reptiles at a bookstore, buy it. It's a real classic. And what Colbert showed is he just looked at Western North America. Here's slice A, slice B, slice C, from oldest to youngest. And these bars are the different dinosaurs. And you can see what's happening. They're dropping out. It's a stepwise extinction by his analysis. Now, I will tell you, this has never been agreed on, whether it's a stepwise extinction where these guys went out, and these guys, and finally those guys, or whether it's really, their paleontologists would tell you dinosaurs were gangbusters till the end. Then they had a really bad day. The asteroid hit, and boom, they're gone. That's nonsense. I don't know. What should I? Consider this stuff. This is something that I asked myself several years ago when I was looking at these extinctions. Today, you can find this online, there are about 5,000 genera of tetrapods on Earth. Now, what are tetrapods? Reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals. Okay? Now, I would say to you, probably half of those are birds. So just take 2,000 off the deck and say, maybe today there are about 2,000 genera of tetrapods that could be related to late Cretaceous. So you're telling me that 10 genera or 50 is a mass extinction? Now, we could argue, some would argue, that diversity was lower. If I go back to the Permian, there wasn't as many genera, but how many do you want to take off the table? Okay, so let me knock this number down to 2,500 by taking the birds out. There are no Permian birds. Then let's just say, okay, let's half it. Let's go down to 1,250. Let's say there were 1,250 genera in the Permian. You're telling me that 10 going extinct is a mass extinction? Come on. I mean, I'm not a great mathematician by any means, but I can tell you the math here doesn't support a mass extinction. We're looking at very small samples that people are claiming tell us of mass extinction when we know that diversity was way higher than what we're seeing. And that's one reason, this is an important take-home message. You can't really trust the diversity numbers. Not only are they back-of-the-envelope estimates, but we just don't know what diversity was, because we're always finding new kinds of animal fossils, plant fossils. There's a lot out there to be discovered. That's why, to me, it's not so important the diversity crash. What's important to me is the loss of major groups and the ecosystem restructuring. Those are the real signatures of a mass extinction. How diversity crashes, by any reasonable argument about diversity, there was no extinction on land of tetrapods at the end of the Permian that would be a mass extinction, and even at the end of the Cretaceous, there's nothing. So I don't think there was a mass extinction on land at the end of the Cretaceous. There wasn't a plant extinction. That's an important point. Anyway, the impact, I like this picture. We are blessed. New Mexico, you know, when they discovered the impact, when Louis and Walter Alvarez discovered it in Italy, they were looking at marine rocks, rocks that were deposited at the bottom of the seafloor. The first place they found the iridium layer on land was in little old New Mexico, just up the road from Raton. You can go see this. You go to Raton, you drive up, it's called Goat Hill, you go to the city park. Here's my hammer. You see that light-colored layer right there? That's the iridium clay. And this was figured out in the early 80s, and it's important. There's no doubt the impact occurred. But this is a huge planet. It's a complex place. Are you telling me that if an asteroid hits the Gulf of Mexico, and I'm living in Mongolia on the other side of the planet, that it's going to kill me? Really? Not necessarily. I would argue not at all. You know, I'm not sure the impact was enough. I mean, so then the question becomes, what does it take to cause an extinction on land? Well, here's something relatively new. We knew for a long time, geologists, paleontologists, that right around the end of the Cretaceous there was enormous volcanism in what's now India. And it produced what are called the Deccan traps. Trap is an old, I think it's a Norwegian word, that we used early in geology for lavas. And the British tended to use it, so the old British colonies, they still call it traps. There's this huge Deccan field. There it is. And it was thought for a long time that Deccan erupted over the course of about 10 million years that encompassed the end of the Cretaceous. So it alone was not a major effect on the extinction. But with new analytical techniques, we now know that Deccan, although there were Deccan eruptions over millions of years, almost all the Deccan lava came out right around the end of the Cretaceous. There was an enormous volcanic eruption. And then my favorite part of this is you get people arguing, well, you know, that asteroid, I saw a guy who's a physicist. You know, that alone, you know, destroyed his credibility with me. But no, seriously. I saw a physicist who came to a geology meeting, and he argued that when the asteroid came in, he had all this ballistic stuff going, it split in two, God bless it, and one of them hit India. And then the best part is when it hit India, it was digested into the magma. It causes heat. So there's no remnant of the asteroid. You can't even test the idea. But anyway, that aside, we now know that volcanism played a role. The thinking, and this is real new, this is the last like 2 or 3 years. The thinking is, yeah, Deccan volcanism probably had an effect on the extinctions. It wasn't just the asteroid alone. Whether or not you believe the asteroid split in two, I don't know. So, here we are at the end of the Cretaceous. Look at that. Isn't that dynamic? You can make a movie out of that, right? Get some cave people, you know, scantily clad cave people wearing skins and stuff, running around with the dinosaurs. Anyway, there was a huge diversity crash in the oceans. We saw major clades go away. The marine ecosystem in the nectonic realm, the swimmers and the floaters, that was restructured. The dinosaurs had drama, but there was no mass extinction on land. But to me, this is the second. This is the second of the big five. Okay, now let me wrap it up. I saw a book that somebody published called The Sixth Extinction. And it wasn't Mike Benton. It wasn't, you know, When Life Nearly Died guy. It was a good title. So the thinking is that now we're going through a mass extinction. Okay? And therefore, if you thought there were 5, this would be the 6th. This is a real number. We know that we have, one way or another, driven about 1,600 species of animals and plants extinct in the last 400 years. That seems like a big number. It's not a very big number, really. I mean, we could have done better, right? So what's going on? Well, the United Nations put out a report on extinction in 2019. Any of you familiar with it? It's freely available online. I really invite you to Google it and read it. It's a very interesting report. And the reason it's fascinating is starting here. How many species of organisms are living on Earth today? And I'm not going to include bacteria. Take bacteria off the table. Just animals, metazoans, and plants. How many species are there? Answer, we don't know. When you get into the technical literature, the biology literature on this subject, you see numbers that range from 3 million to 13 million. That's a big difference. The UN report, smart folks, they split the difference and said, okay, there's 8 million. So let's say there's 8 million, and okay, that's fine. There's 8 million extant species, and you're telling me 10 reptiles go extinct? You've heard me, that's a mass extinction, but anyway, I already covered that. So according to the UN report, about 1 million of them are threatened with extinction right now. And the threats come primarily from habitat destruction. And by habitat destruction, they didn't really mean climate change. In fact, the report sort of doesn't say climate change is looking like a big cause of extinction yet. What they're talking about are things like overgrazing, fishing, pollution, real habitat destruction that's human caused, okay? It doesn't rise to a mass extinction. We're not there yet. We don't have a big enough diversity drop. We haven't seen major clades go away. We don't have major ecosystem restructuring yet. Now, I'm a paleontologist, right? I can tell you about what happened. I'm not good at predicting what will happen, okay? So don't assume I'm going to tell you what will happen. I would say I tend to agree that we're probably heading into a substantial, at least diversity crisis, unless things really change. And how will things change? We got to kill, most of the people on Earth to stop destroying the habitats of all these critters, right? So I don't know that, but the point is this is what's going on, and here's the key thing: it's human cause, okay? All of the mass extinctions, whether you agree with them or not, of the past had nothing to do with humanity. There were no people 66 million years ago. There were no people 202 million years ago. So that's why I say the extinctions going on today have no real relationship to the ancient extinctions I've talked about, because their causes, whatever they may be, and I think volcanism is a good, strong primary cause, have nothing to do with humanity. So whatever extinctions are going on now have a lot to do with people, and that's why I think there's a disconnect. I don't think the old extinctions teach us much about this. If we had people 60 million years ago, they might. So here are my conclusions again. I would say to you again, there were no big five, there were just the big two, and Permian and Cretaceous. And the end Cretaceous, both of them weren't even mass extinctions on land. And I mentioned this, but I'll say it now. There are no mass extinctions of land plants, to go with the big extinctions. So if you don't, how do you kill off a lot of animals? You take their food away, right? And if you don't kill off land plants, how do you get the trophic structure, the food chain, to collapse on land? Without a land-based extinction of plants, how do you have a land-based extinction of animals? Can you really believe that, an asteroid hit and everybody fell over? Doesn't work. So, I think John Phillips had it right in 1860. We have learned a lot. It's not fair to say we're just here, but of course, as Huxley once famously said, this idea of 5 mass extinctions is a wonderful idea. It's been a neat idea for 40 some odd years, but the facts don't add up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for attending. I'm going to ask you if you have any questions to come down and talk to Dr. Lucas in person, because we have to get out of here in 30 minutes. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for your talk.